Hello, Salesforce Ohana. I'm Warren Walters, and thank you all so much for joining me in this session on the introduction to Salesforce Flows for Business Analysts. Quick shout out to the Salesforce Business Analyst Summit and Tony and Vanessa for asking me to speak on this topic and for putting this all together. So like I mentioned earlier, I'm Warren Walters. I have, well, depending on when you're watching this, I have 7 years of experience in the Salesforce ecosystem, or I guess 7 years plus. Most of that time it's on development and doing other things, like mostly code related, programmatic related things in the Salesforce ecosystem, but I've done many different roles and I'm just a Salesforce enthusiast. So I love Salesforce Flows, the automations on the platform. I help put together FlowFest. So very familiar with Flows and with the entire process of running projects and being in the Salesforce ecosystem. So not just development, but business analyst roles, consulting roles, and architecture and administrative roles. I kind of love it all, but my day-to-day, I'm a developer. So let's jump directly into it. What I want to start out with the introduction to Salesforce Flow is like, why do we care about flows and where do they come from, right? So this starts out with Salesforce automations. So Salesforce automations are tools that can be used on the Salesforce platform to create business process, to trigger things or to manipulate information as it flows across. Salesforce is not just a static thing. We can do many different things with it, and the platform is very customizable and configurable so that we can do kind of whatever we want with it. So not every business works the same, and because of that, they have different processes that need to get created. For example, maybe you own a car sales company, and for customer discounts or something like that, it needs to go through an approval process. So that approval process is most likely unique for your specific organization. Maybe it goes to the VP of sales or whoever the floor manager is, and they can approve up to 25% of a discount, and then anything past 50% is it needs to go to the owner or the manager of the sales floor for that time. So that process may be specific to your business, but for another business, it could be completely different. Maybe it goes to the controller or finance for approvals. And that's just one example. Everyone has different examples for them to accomplish whatever business needs that they have. So where does all of this automation fit in? Automations are more along the lines of things that automatically happen. So these are processes that you can create to automatically change things, automatically have events or triggers occur, and then actions come out of those. So when we look at automations, there are two main categories that I put them in, but you can kind of break them up into a few more if you need to. But one is the declarative side, and then one is the programmatic side. So on the declarative side, those are things that you can do with clicks and not code like that. That's the big distinction. Everything you can do without click or only clicks, it's declarative. And then on the programmatic side, you're doing it with a program or you're doing it with code. The declarative side of things, this is where we step into the realm of things that admins can do, things that are configurable inside of the Salesforce ecosystem or the Salesforce platform that we can change around with clicks so that they'll do whatever we want. For example, we can set up a flow, and we'll get to flows. We can set up an automation that can send out an email if a deal has been waiting or it hasn't been updated in 30 days, something like that. That's something you can configure with clicks on the Salesforce platform, and you don't need to write any specific code because it's already built in. It's out of the box, so to speak, on the Salesforce platform. Now, when we move into programmatic automations, these are things that you have to write code to get them done, but they're generally a bit more complex, and they require some additional pieces to make them work properly. So for example, that same deal that we're talking about that's been sitting there for 30 days, maybe we need to send a notification to another system completely using an API or using a call out to start closing down that deal or to shut off some access that they had with another platform. So that's where programmatic things come into play, where you're using code to, it's all still based on maybe record updates or some sort of trigger that happens in the system, but it is a change that is, or the actual process is being done based on code. So when we look at this kind of flow chart or matrix here, flows sit on the declarative side of that, which is very powerful, and it has a lot of things that I can do under the hood. But Flow Builder is a configuration or declarative tool, and it has a bunch of different capabilities for it. So it can be launched when like things change on records, with platform events, from APIs. So, you know, a third party accessing Salesforce and then calling a flow. You can use it when there's like different screens and things like that going on, and we'll dive a bit deeper into flows, and it can connect in many different areas. So now we're going to talk a little bit deeper on like what flows can do, why do we want to use flows, and what it's kind of for, like where's the best case scenarios to use them. So flows, they are an automation tool that is all, let's say, all clicks as of right now. Being a developer, I know how to like shove some code into flows to make them work, and we'll kind of touch on that at the end there. But it is an automation tool that is generally all clicks. You want to configure something inside of the Salesforce system, and you don't need to know how to code or know Java or anything like that. Don't need to know Apex to understand or to get a grasp of what's going on. To write your flows, you're going to be using a tool called the Flow Builder that's inside of the setup on the inside of Salesforce. So in the back end of Salesforce, you do need to be an administrator to access the Flow Builder to be able to create it. And then for flows, there are a bunch of different use cases for it. I'm going to show you a few, but generally, you know, Flow has a lot of different capabilities. So things like record updates or sending emails, having a wizard, so being able to walk your customers or your users through a specific set of things. That's when you want to use flows, because they are the ideal tool for it. When we think back to that programmatic way of doing things, it's a bit cumbersome to get things done with code. There's a long drawn out process. It takes a lot of time to get it from the idea to, you know, you have to have a specialized skill set to write the code, and then it needs to be deployed, tested, and all of that stuff, where flows can be done a little bit faster. They should be tested and all of that, but you can, you know, configure them in a sandbox, test them out most likely yourself, and you don't have to have that extremely specialized skill set, which is development. And flows are great for that kind of like stepping stone, especially if you want to learn some development, because a lot of the concepts are transferable. So as we jump into kind of like looking at some different flows, just remember these initial ideas like record updates and sending emails are just the tip of the iceberg. Flows can do a lot of different things, and it's just a matter of putting your mind to it and seeing, you know, what your challenge is, and always understanding like, hey, what are the capabilities of it? And the other thing is that Salesforce is always adding functionality to flows every release. So if we look from just even last year, where flows have been starting to really pick up steam and get regular updates and things like that, we're getting some features that make it extremely powerful and extremely versatile for admins and BAs to recommend on their projects or for whatever they're doing, instead of going to code and having that technical debt from the code side of things. It's a lot easier to clean up flow technical debt than it is to clean up code technical debt. So now we're going to kind of talk about the different types of flows. And the first one here, one that a lot of you have probably seen, is the Screenflow. So Screenflows run, and they are generally used to present information to the user. We want to walk the user through maybe certain steps, or we want them to review information before the flow does some tasks or update records and things like that. So whenever you want to ask questions or have some sort of interaction from the end user, you'll want to use a Screenflow. And these are really great for having an all-encompassing area. You can extend them. You can have use them in different sequences, connecting them with each other, and even using some of the other types of flows that are out there to bring things in. Another really great tip, and it was kind of what I was talking about when I mentioned like adding code into it, is that Screenflows have a specific set of abilities and features that it has, and if you ever hit that limit, you can actually bring in code or Lightning Web Components into your Screenflow to kind of get that look and feel or that specific component that you're looking for. One great example is the data table type of Screenflow element. Recently, it was not possible to get a data table element inside of a Screenflow, so you had to bring in code, a Lightning Web Component, drop that into your Screenflow, and then do all of your manipulation, anything like that. Now, this was really great because as long as it could get done in a Lightning Web Component, you could put it inside of a flow. So you didn't have to build all of the wizarding and the navigation and all of that stuff that comes with a Screenflow outside of it in your Lightning Web Component. You just build that specific component and you drop it inside. So as you're starting to think of different limitations and things that can happen inside of your flow as a BA or as an admin, maybe you know, like, okay, I need to build some sort of custom table, and I know that can only be done in Lightning Web Components. Instead of saying, okay, let's build the entire process inside of a Lightning Web Component, let's say, you would then conversely say, let's just put this inside of a flow and use that individual component that a developer can create and drop it inside of a flow. So that's where that kind of power and extension really comes into. You're extending the baseline functionality of the Screenflow with Lightning Web Components, so making it more versatile. Now let's check out our Screenflow live. First thing we want to do is go into the setup. I'm already here, but just to show you, go into the setup, go to flow. I type in flows and then go to flows. Some of these on here you won't see in like a brand new org, or maybe your organization already has a ton of flows in here already. But from actually doing, I think these are some FlowFest flows. So we're going to be taking a look at those while we learn about them. So really quickly, if you've never created a flow, there's this new flow button in here. You have the option to create a Screenflow, which we've talked about briefly, a record trigger flow, which you can see launches based on some sort of action on a record, scheduled flow, which you schedule it and it runs on a batch, platform event flow. So these are triggered from platform messages. So things that come from outside of Salesforce, triggering these. And then the auto launch flows, which are basically your subflows, and these kind of like run in the background. So I know I wanted to show you all of this because I want to make sure that you're familiar with the different types. And when you're deciding like, hey, what's the best type of flow to use on one of these things or use on your project, you can know the different types that are out there. And there are actually a ton more, but we won't worry about that for right now. So instead of doing, I'll stop here because I know some of you, your job title or what you want to do kind of ends right here, right? We want to understand flows. We want to understand what we create. And this is not what this presentation is for. So like teach you how to create flows and go through that. That's technically a long conversation, but just being aware of all the different tools and things that are out there in flows is what I'm going to be showing you, introductory style. So I'm going to close that out, and then let's take a look at this create a class Screenflow that exists in here. So at first glance, this can look a little overwhelming, but we'll just kind of take it from the beginning and see where it starts, right? It starts at this record over here, and this is the starting point. And then it's going to traverse down go through. This looks like a decision. I know we haven't talked about that. But whatever a decision is, it's going to make some choices on where it's going to go. And then it will finally go through some additional screens and end at the case creation. So this is specific for this screen flow, but some things I want you all to notice is just like some of the color coding that's going on here. So assignments, and assignments basically means we're setting some sort of value. The assignments are this orange color, and any of the logic operators are going to be this orange color. So assignments are this, decisions, which these are basically if statements, are orange. And then here's some more assignments going on here. We'll talk about the left pane in a second, but you can see all of the different logical elements that are orange. Then the screen elements are blue. So screen elements are always things that we're going to be presenting to the user. So this is what the screen is going to look like. We can set our titles, our text, and all of those kind of things. Not going to go into too much detail on how these are created and set up, but just so that you're aware of the different types of elements that are here. And then the data elements, where you're actually either creating records, manipulating records, and doing DML statements, so data manipulation language. So doing things like lookups and creating and deleting records kind of live in this pink section in here. Now we'll step over to the toolbox. You can see they call this interaction section, so you can do get screens, you can call actions. So actions could be pre-built things, and I'll drag one over so we can see what they are. But actions will be things like sending emails and things that are potentially outside of flow capabilities. You can build actions to call to do these things. So sending email is one. If you ever build any Apex, they can show up in here as well. And there's lots of things that can happen in actions. Subflows are calling another flow, and we'll probably take a look at that in another demo. And then we have all of the different logical elements. So these are things like your assignments, your decisions, and your loops. So loops are very important for iterating over collection values. Then we have collection sorts and filters. So once you have an entire collection, how do you filter them? So get specific records that you're looking for, and then how do you sort them to have them in the correct order that you're looking for? Then you have the data ones, so things like creating, updating, editing, and deleting records. So CRUD. Well, I guess the read isn't in there, if you know what CRUD means: create, read, update, and delete. But we have create, update, get, which I guess is technically read, and the delete, and then rollback. So if something goes wrong, or if there's some specific trigger, we want to send everything back in a rollback. So just making sure that you're aware of some of the different pieces of flows that exist. Other than that, you can go to the flow manager to check out all of the different elements and things like that exist on here. So now kind of moving more into, let's say you wanted to either just get to understand this flow or maybe even debug it a little bit more. Let's take a look at some of the different values in here. So we have this drop down for freeform, which means you can drag this around to have it in whatever layout that you want it to be. But I have actually started to prefer auto layout, which is it automatically sets the layout for you and it brings it in this top down sort of section. So I've been liking auto layout, and I think for beginners and as you're starting out, auto layout is great to kind of like set it and forget it. It does a lot of things for you. Okay, now let's move on to debugging. So we've got this set up in our auto layout. We can kind of see what's going on. It starts here. It goes to this screen. There's some assignments and a few other things that are happening. But what does this actually look like? Well, you can come over to the debug screen, hit debug, and then it will open up and run the flow for you, and it'll actually give you information on the flow so that you can see what's going on behind the hood. Only you as an admin will, or whoever's creating the flow, will be able to see this. And then as a business analyst, if your flow isn't working right, or if you're running user acceptance testing or working with users and something doesn't even seem to be working right, this could be a good place to go to test out to see how the flow is actually working under the hood, if all the values are being set properly and stuff like that. So I clicked on that debug button for Screenflows. It opens up a new page. You'll want to hit run. And then this is what the flow will look like, but at the right side over here, it will give you some additional details about the flow itself. So we can see here, it gives you the flow version and the name and all of that stuff, which is great. But if we start filling out this flow, I missed that twice. Let's correct that. If we start filling out this flow, we can see here that we had our screen that came through and the different information that got set on this screen. And as we continue to walk through this, we can see that more values are being set. If there's anything like creating records or updating records, doing assignment, it's telling us what is going on. So as we're debugging our flows, we can see the different information in here. And if you're not following 100%, it's going through all the different values that's in here, right? If we look at the first section there, or if we look at the first screen, which is here, and we're kind of seeing in the debug, it says confirm customer details. Oh, sorry, I think that was the second screen. Confirm customer details. We put that in, and then when we go down, there's a get record for the contact lookup, and then there's a decision element. So here's that decision element. So it's going through all of the flow, and especially in the screen flow, it's piece by piece, and it stops at certain sections, and then it's doing all of the pieces of it, and then creating. It's giving us the output that is there. And now this is really cool for, this flow is an example of creating a case, and it's walking let's say that I'm like a call person, somebody calls in, it's walking me through what I should say, the different information that I need to put in to actually create this case at the end of the day. So it's making it a little bit easier for me as the user. Maybe I do this, hundreds of times a day. Instead of going to the record, hitting new, and having to search for all the different fields that exist out there, I can have a button that pops this flow up and just have it walk through this wizard, this questionnaire for me, instead of having to deal with like creating a record. So this is a much more seamless and streamlined experience for the individual user versus having to create records and going through it without a wizard. So now we want to jump into our auto launch flows. We talked about screen flows. They're great for getting user input and for understanding, for walking people through or guiding people through. Now for our auto launch flows, these are more things that run in the background. They are flows that can process data when certain actions happens or certain information gets sent by the user. So these are really great for things like calculations after like a certain button press or something like that. Auto launch flows can also be used in like subflows or for subsections of a flow. So if you have a specific piece of automation or some sort of calculation that is useful in many different places, then you can create it as an auto launch flow and reuse it in multiple places. Auto launch flows can also be called from Apex and different automation, and it makes it really handy for a developer to call flows or auto launch flows and that calculations or the process that exists in there is controlled by an admin. So it gives more flexibility for and more modularization of the combinations of clicks and code, so that you can say, hey, this specific section is going to be controlled more by the business instead of it being locked into code. It reduces that barrier to entry for things that need to get changed very often, because we know if we need to change code rapidly, then there's that long process that I mentioned earlier that needs to happen for it. So if a portion of it, and the portion that needs to change a lot, is controlled inside of an auto launch flow, then it's a lot easier for that specific piece to change. Okay, so let's take a look at some different auto launch flows. I'm going to take a look at, let's maybe do this opportunity account revenue auto launch flow. So in this one, the first thing that you may notice right out the gate is that the toolbox has changed a little bit. There's not as many elements that we had before. If I go to freeform, you can see it. So we're missing that rollback, and we're missing the screen flow, and you might be missing a couple others that I don't know about. But yeah, we're missing a few different elements in here, and that's just the nature of not needing that screen portion of the auto launch flows. So now let me jump back into auto layout, just so that we get an idea of how this is kind of working. Is that we're going to always start here, and it's going to jump into an opportunity get. So we're getting a specific opportunity based on some sort of variable that comes through. So if you've never really heard of variables or don't know how they work, they're just a container for information. And in this case, this variable gets the account ID, and then the get record is doing a search based on that account ID. And as long as the account ID matches and the stage is 1, then that account will be found inside of the flows. So when you're doing things like debugging or talking about building out flows with your team, you can start defining these things ahead of time, saying like, okay, we're going to need a variable to hold the account ID, because it's coming from somewhere else. And auto launch flows, a lot of times they get information from other areas to then run their calculations. This calculation is after we get that looks like opportunity records. Yeah, after we get the opportunity based on the account ID, we are going to update the account with the account ID, and it looks like there's a specific lookup, and we're setting that account ID. So as a BA, you may not go this detailed in saying like, okay, we're gonna set this specific value, but you'll need to know, or you'll need to understand, like, some of these fields need to already exist, and how the searching is going to kind of work, so that the admin or whoever's the architect, whoever's building these things out, they have the correct information that they need to get all of their work done. The other thing that I want to comment here is since values often come into auto launch flows, there are certain ways of setting up those variables and values. So one example is to allow things for input, and that's specifically on a variable. So if you are ever creating an auto launch flow and it needs to receive information inside of it, you can set the input field, or I guess availability outside of flows field. So checking this box means that we can send this value inside of the auto launch flow, and then available for output, it means that other people can, or other flows or other automations can use this specific value outside of the flow. So we're sending values in, it does its calculation, and then it sends it back out. This is really cool for things like calculations. You're going to create like new records and things like that. You send your initial values in, or your initial record in that's creating it, and then you spit back out on your output side of things. You spit back out the new record, and then you're able to run more manipulations on top of it. One other thing is that I just made a change to this, and that change is not automatically active on the flow. So to make it active, we have got to save as or save a new version of that particular flow. We can also create a brand new version of that same exact flow, but it's not going to be, in the same version list for it. And then we also have some advanced options here. So a lot of times we can choose how the context of the flow. So if it runs as system or as user, basically how it launches, we can say that it always enforces a sharing. So basically running as a user, and then we can run it without sharing. So it runs it as system. So this can be, I guess, a little dangerous because when you're running things as system, it can see everything, and maybe you don't want your users to see everything. So you'll want to be careful about using that. But when you're debugging or going through and maybe you have like sharing or visibility errors, some of these options may be the culprit. The other thing is, setting the version numbers as the versions continue to increase, the functionality and capabilities increase. So you may need to look at the different versions if something's not, an old flow isn't working and you're looking for new features. Updating the version may be one of those things that can help you. And then there's always the description or the label for the flow. So I'm going to go ahead and save a new version of this, and then we see we have this activate button now. If we made a minor change here, let's remove this and save. Now that we're in that like unpublished version, we can see that it's inactive. Version 2 is inactive. We can always just do saves on minor changes, but until we mark it as active, then none of our changes are going to go through. So if we want this to actually, be live, we're going to hit active or activate. And then now that will allow anytime that anyone runs this flow outside of the flow builder, so maybe it's on a page, maybe it's through automation, this flow will be the one that gets triggered. One other question that may come up is, how do I see like the old versions? Maybe there is something broken in the one that I just made go live, and I want to turn back the other one on. So to do that, you'll come over to this drop down over here to the right. So pick whichever flow you're looking at, view the details and versions. And then now we can activate or deactivate some, the different versions that are in here, and we can actually delete old ones as well. Really quickly, let's take a look at another auto launch flow, because that one was a little simple, I'll say, 2 elements. Just one that's a little more complicated, where we're running through a few different get records, and we're actually doing a loop. So loops, they take in a collection. So basically a list of elements or list of records that you're dealing with. And then it goes over each of them. You can do your processing, your whatever business process it is, and then the final output you can use to, in this case, it's creating, looks like it's creating some child records for it, but you can do whatever processing you need at the end of your loop. So that's really fun. And once again, this is an auto launch flow, so it's kind of like its own individual flow, and it doesn't get triggered by anything to launch, or it cannot self-trigger to launch any of this business process. It needs to be done based on a button click or some sort of external force triggering this to run. Now let's jump into record trigger flows. These are kind of new, and they basically work like Apex triggers if you're familiar with those. It needs some sort of background record change to happen, and then these flows will go off. So for example, you want to when an opportunity is closed won, you want to create a renewal opportunity. So the record is saved, and all of the criteria is met, and it triggers that process to happen. So these one are really cool and really awesome and powerful because you're now moving some things that were traditionally held inside of code you can now use that inside of flows, which is really powerful. So some of the big things here is that you can have criteria to filter out the record changes, because if you have a big org or an org that has a lot of changes on it, you may not want all of your changes or all of your record trigger flows to go off for every single one. You may want to just filter it down to those specific flows or those specific records so that it can be more efficient and run faster. All right, so taking a look at the opportunity main trigger flow that I have here. So this is a record trigger flow, and this is actually, I guess, one tidbit or one thing that I like to do is generally having only one type of one record trigger flow per object. So this is kind of like an architectural design, a framework that happens, and as you as a BA start to build out or make recommendations around these, you want to not really try to force something like this, but you want to make sure that they're following best practices where if a record trigger flow already exists, you can then use the existing one instead of creating a whole new one, and it gets really hard to maintain multiple record trigger flows on the same object. You don't know which one's firing first and all of this stuff. Taking a look at the record trigger flow that we have here, our start element is a little bit different from the other ones. If we click into here, we see that we get some of the triggering configuration, right? So we can start it when the record is created or updated, or it's deleted, right? So we have all of those options, and then we also have the options to, let's start here. So add criteria in. So if we only wanted, I think this one is on the opportunity. So let's say we only wanted the stage is prospecting, right? So only opportunities that are updated that meet this criteria will even be considered to go through this flow in here. So that's really awesome. And then some other things is we can decide when this gets updated. So every time the criteria is matched. So if we have a record and the value is already prospecting and we save some other values, then this flow will go off. Or we have the option to say only when the conditions are met. So only if the stage name is updated to prospecting will this flow go off, which is their subtle difference, but depending on what you want to happen, it's important for you to know which one of these you want to choose from. And then for the optimization piece of it, there is the fast field updates, which these are basically the before trigger. You can see it down here, the before record trigger flows, and then the after record trigger flows. Before trigger flows, they basically are used for a lot of things like validation and generally updating information on the same record. And then after trigger flows are for after things that process. So everything or most things will have processed by the time it gets to this flow. And it's best to use these when you want to update related records or do any other information like that. There are entire documents that go over the details of this. I just want to make sure to give you an overview, but I've also have some resources for that as well. And then if our flow is entered in here, we see that we're actually calling a subflow, which I mentioned earlier is some of the key or some of the reasons that you would want to use the subflow is for that modularity and customization so that you can use it in different places or all over the place. So for this example, when an opportunity comes through, it's going to call this subflow, and then it's passing in that account ID. So that's where that input value comes into play. We're passing that account ID value in, and we can technically get an account ID value after this flow has completed. We can get a value in there. one other thing that's pretty cool is the debugging of record trigger flows. We can choose if the record is created or updated, and we can like select the test opportunity, and then it loads in data for us so that we can change things. And we need to look on here for the stage. And our example said, I don't remember if we saved it, but our example said for prospecting. And when we run that, we see that it's running through here, so it didn't open up another screen. And we can expand these out so that we can see the different variables, values, and things that are running inside of here. So this is really cool for debugging. You're going through and you want to debug a record trigger flow, and then you can also convert these to tests, which this is a whole nother potentially big topic on its own. But you can create tests for your flows. Well, this is still in beta, but you can create tests for your flows so that you know that they're working in all of your environments the same. So lots to go into detail in here. This is going to be very important as you move into more complex flows. So this is something that you'll want to look into, especially when you're testing and making sure when you're doing like regression testing and testing with users and stuff like that, to make sure that things are working as they should. So super cool stuff there. Okay, so let's now round things out with some flow best practices. And a lot of these are gonna, if you're familiar with Process Builder, a lot of them are gonna kind of transfer over as well. And some of them are going to be common sense. You would have heard them before, but especially for those new BAs, people trying to get into Salesforce, some of this may be new. So hard coding IDs, number one, always never a good idea. It's going to come to bite you in the butt one way or another. It's happened to me multiple times. Don't be lazy. Work on ways of dynamically setting the IDs. You can do this by querying things like the record types or using the developer names for the whatever you're working with, or using things like labels, right? So custom labels can be used inside, or custom metadata or custom settings, but we'll stay with custom labels. But those metadata can be queried inside of flows, and you can use them inside of your flows to make it more dynamic and more scalable for the future. Another one is plan your flows. You don't need to work on them by yourself, so to speak. Work with the rest of your team, work with other people in the Salesforce Ohana to make sure that your flow is getting created and built out as best it can. One other thing that I like to do is be consistent with naming. So if you start off all your variables with VAR and the variable name, do that across the board. Same thing with naming your flows all together. Find some naming scheme that works for you and your company, and implement it across the board. Limit the number of flows you have. So an organization with like 50, 60, 70, 100 flows is very cumbersome and harder to maintain. You'll want to limit the number of flows that you have so that you can understand it better. And that moves a little bit more into the having like one record trigger flow per object and stuff like that. Error handling, you want to do it. So like the fault screens and things like that. Very important so that the user doesn't get like a nasty message. You can move them in certain ways so that they don't get giant error screens. It really is a better user experience when you're using things like fault messages. And then DMLs inside of loops. So all of those like updates, get records and stuff like that, you shouldn't have them inside of loops. You should have them outside of loops, and then use certain techniques to filter them down or to gather them up, whatever you're actually doing with it. And that's kind of it, at least for this introduction. I know I threw a lot of information out there for you. There are some really great trails out there for you to look at. So definitely take a look at the ones that I've linked here and run through all of those in Trailhead. And then I also have some additional links for some like what automation tools to use and what's a good architecture for record trigger flows. So make sure to check out these links, and they should be posted in the Salesforce Summit packs as well, so that you can have access to these. And let me know what resources that you find along the way. I know this definitely isn't all of them, and I want to make sure to keep like updating this and having the best resources for everybody to use. And then I just kind of want to round things out with saying thank you all so much for joining and watching and being a part of the Salesforce community. And just thank you for your work that you do. If you're already a BA, I know for me and people in the IT field in general don't really get, a pat on the back or anything like that. Most of the time we only get a call when things are going wrong, right? So thank you for all the work that you're doing. And if you're an aspiring BA or Salesforce professional, keep working at it and you'll get there eventually. Last shout outs to Tony again and the Salesforce Summit or BA Summit. So thank you all for inviting me, and I appreciate, being part of this and having the opportunity to speak. So once again, I'm Warren Walters, or Walters954, and I believe in you.